We need to talk about this JD Vance situation because it changes everything. So it broke over the weekend that JD Vance is apparently planning to potentially suspend the run for president that he was going to do in 2028. This might seem really crazy at first because everyone thought this is the only candidate they can really run in the GOP. It's clearly the person that Trump set up as his heir, and he got a lot of screen time early on into this presidency, so why would it not be him? But there's been some pretty significant changes in the last couple of weeks even that indicates why this isn't really an option anymore. Now, the Daily Mail article that highlights this claims that the major reason for this, I guess, change in plan is because Tulsi Gabbard has left the White House. Now, you might say, well, was she planning to be his VP or whatever? It's not that, but more that it indicates the trajectory of Trump's own cabinet. And right now, the GOP is just Trump. Trump has fully shed the dove approach that he had in the campaign. He is no longer pretending to be someone who is anti-war, anti-conflict, and instead someone who is objectively a strongman. But this goes back even to early parts of the presidency. Think about how he handled Ukraine. Think about his threats towards Canada, his threats towards Greenland. Clearly, Trump is not really concerned with being a dove. It was just a campaign tactic, which fair enough. But Vance has really attached his entire being to this stuff. So what's going on here? And I think important context to understand these sort of things at play is that Vance himself is sort of an enigma, not in the way that Trump is, but more because Vance is a black hole. Go look through Vance's life. Like, who is he? What does he do? What does he represent? What does he believe? We don't have much of an understanding of what Vance's ideology is prior to him going to Yale Law, but shortly after Yale Law, Vance gets involved with Peter Thiel. Now, what does Peter Thiel represent? Peter Thiel is a strange guy. You know, he was a co-founder of PayPal, has become a really important billionaire in the tech world, has funded quite a lot of political projects, for instance. Vance's own placement in the vice presidency role is likely in itself a product of Peter Thiel, of Trump having to try to kind of get on terms with the tech right in Silicon Valley. But we kind of looked at the history of JD Vance with Peter Thiel to understand sort of what's going on. So Thiel comes out and seems to form a partnership with Vance. He brings him into his VC capital network post law school. Vance famously has never apparently worked a day as a lawyer, and Vance's fund under Thiel performs whatever, and he quickly moves into a more culture war politics oriented disposition. But where does Vance go first? Well, it's his book Hillbilly Elegy. Vance goes on a book tour for this, very, very popular book at this point, which is sort of detailing his early life and the struggles he had in Appalachia that he overcame due to the help of primarily his grandmother as well as his own hard work, whatever. But what was curious about this tour and the sort of vibe around Vance during that time was that, he was very, very critical of Trump. Like, exceedingly so. In fact, going as far as to say that he believed that Trump could be America's Hitler. I think it's important to pause at that and break down why he would say something so vitriolic, because in today's climate, it's not really believable. And if you weren't following politics back Trump insanity, or at the very least during the early parts of his presidency, you have to remember the environment all of these tech right people would have been going through. Think back to the Obama era. It really did feel like the Fukuyama end of history moment, because you had this weird dynamic where the neocons and neolibs had policy disagreements, of course, but their fundamentals were broadly shared. They agreed on foreign policy decisions the majority of the time, at least in the broader sense, and they were in general kind of on the same page for the liberal origins and liberal goals of America. And the presentation was very formal for that respect. You had kind of laughable campaign controversies during that period compared to what you would have now. So think to like someone like Thiel. He's thinking, how do I penetrate American politics? Well, any vessel that Thiel uses, or any puppet that he uses, has to be someone who can speak to the political environment. And that environment distinctly was that of sort of Washington suit culture, meaning that you need someone who's like an Obama-like figure. Now, what was Obama? Obama was smart. He came off as being educated. He spoke the language of DC, but he was a good orator. People liked listening to him, and he appealed to people of a variety of class backgrounds. He represented the formalism of American politics while still being approachable, perfectly encapsulated by his interaction with Anthony Bourdain at dinner. Vance's re-entry into politics then comes in the post-Trump era, the first post-Trump era, and he rebrands as a sort of MAGA Republican, and he's able to win a really important role. In 2023, Peter Thiel ends up funding J.D. Vance's political run for Senate in Ohio, and he's able to win. And he rebrands himself entirely in this period, not as a Obama for the Republican Party, but instead a intellectualized version of a MAGA Republican. Someone who can speak the language of someone educated by Yale Law, but exclusively with MAGA talking points. He was a hardliner. And all the way through his Trump presidency, he has been a MAGA hardliner at every point, to a degree that perhaps was destructive to himself, most famously with his treatment of Zelensky in the White House, in early 2025. So what isn't working? Why is he now considering just dropping out? Well, it's because Rubio had a similar pathway in terms of having to convert from a different kind of Republican into a MAGA Republican, but his success has been extraordinary comparatively. You see, in the first Trump presidency, you still had the neocon establishment in the White House and also just in the Republican Party in general. So looking back to a lot of the moments of policy in the White House of Trump v1, you're just seeing neocons kind of work at a reduced efficiency in that they're still getting what they want to get done, but it's without a lot of the nuance or a lot of the speed they could have with a more neocon president. They're kind of fighting against Trump, but broadly speaking, things are just still going according to plan, broadly speaking. In Trump 2, that just isn't the case, though, obviously. What Trump has now done in this period is he's taken people who are willing to at least cosplay as sycophants and elevated them to extraordinary positions of power and is having them face off. That's why people like Bondi and Tulsi are gone, because they couldn't deliver results that were satisfactory to Trump. But Vance and Rubio are perhaps in a more intense kind of competition because both of them have presidential ambitions. Rubio is going back to the original Trump run in 2015 and losing horrifically. And, he stuck around, though. He clearly wants to lead. And what Trump has given his cabinet leaders is different chances to prove themselves. And if they don't, perform satisfactory, he's shelved them. With Rubio, though, he has been perhaps the most dominant in his performance. Most importantly, because the military and foreign policy digressions that have been at the behest of Rubio, like the Venezuelan operation that captured Maduro, have been successful. And Rubio's polling has been consistently impressive, which is something that Trump has famously cared about no matter how much he denies it. Vance just is not there, though. Vance is consistently fighting this battle that doesn't seem to exist, and it all comes from a LARP that he miscalculated on. When he was making this conversion into a MAGA Republican at the behest of Thiel, he's still playing the game that Thiel wants him to. So it's trying to adopt the Thiel philosophy, the Thiel policy, but with a MAGA Republican veneer. So he converts to Catholicism, in 2023. He is trying to elevate himself in that sense by following dissident right accounts like Captive Dreamer and showing that he's aware of the memes, aware of the more subversive talk, that he's one of the guys. But this has no salience with people who are normal. And by normal, I mean normal Republicans. It has no salience with the majority of the MAGA base. So when you break down what has his success been, it's non-existent. In fact, it's the opposite. He is flailing. He is very, very passive-aggressive in his approach, and he almost speaks to no one when he talks. When he goes to Europe and he berates the Europeans for not having appropriate free speech, the question is consistently, well, who is he speaking to there? Because his administration, the Trump administration, is making attempts at cracking down on free speech to significant degrees, and when he goes to Europe and criticizes that, like what is the consistency? What is the thought process? And who is this landing with? But Rubio is, no matter what happens under his watch, he's always trying to give these sort of broader unifying messaging. So when Groypers attack Indians, Rubio just this weekend goes and says, hey, it's not appropriate to talk about Indian Americans like that. And you should have respect, blah, 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 blah. But Vance, who has an Indian wife, what does he say? He says nothing. Vance has at this point, years of attacks from Groypers on his family, his children, his wife for being, mixed race and Indian. And he says nothing because he knows it would make him look uncool in those environments, those Twitter environments. So it's a miscalculation where he feels like if he has a sort of like based tradcath vibe to him that comports to the online right, that he be able to garner a sort of support, like the zeitgeist of this moment to become president, perhaps, but it's just flailing. And with Gabbard leaving, it's a distinct kind of moment of, oh, wow, there's no other alternatives for me. And this is because Gabbard was the lone sort of dove. And by dove, I mean the MAGA dove that was left in the White House. What this means is they were people who were adherent to a different sort of philosophy than what has been the Republican Party in a long time, which is one of multipolarity. What I mean by multipolarity is you can imagine Eastern Europe and Central Asia is the domain of Russia, and East Asia and the Pacific is probably the domain of China, and then the Western world, Latin America, Canada, the United States is the domain of the United States. Multipolarity people think that peace and the resolving of conflict does not come from the Pax Americana, America controls the world discourse and consensus that has existed since the end of World War II, or at least probably through the Cold War. They instead think that certain parts of the world should have different empires overseeing them. So when they say they're doves, it's not in the immediate sense. It's not in the peace sense. It's in the sense that they believe long term, if you have different empires governing different parts of the world, you have more cohesion and peace available. That's the generous view. I don't buy that, but it's why someone like Vance and Gabbard end up being very pro-Russia. So they'll be anti-peace in Ukraine, or they'll be incredibly incendiary towards Ukraine itself, or they'll be, cautious about, supporting Taiwan's independence, instead of, saying, oh, I'm not sure about that. We're more isolationist. So the rhetoric will come off as isolationist and dovish in that sense, but it's because they believe in a different sort of international project. That sort of thought is championed by some popular people on the right, like Tucker Carlson, and some anti-Israeli voices pick up on that. But when you look at the MAGA base, not even just old people, but younger people too, it just has no salience. It doesn't really land. But Rubio's sort of proud Americana, American empire, but in a very positive way, rhetoric, it does super well. He polls well, and he seems like a better just fit for what the voter feels like. Boomers are going to be alive for a bit longer, and then even then, like Gen X and millennials do not enjoy Vance's message. They don't enjoy his reputation. They don't enjoy his being. And what can he fill it with? Again, this is a guy who seems devoid of ideology that is principled, that is long term. He kind of just bends and goes. Like, let's think about his progress. He started as an Obama shadow for the Republican Party. Then you start converting into some dissident right tradcath, and then you sort of try to butterfly as a multipolarity enjoyer who is pro MAGA, but confusingly, married to an Indian wife or an Indian American wife, and you don't support multiracial stuff outwardly, but you kind of implicitly say there's like a weird confusion of not trying to upset Groypers, but also trying to signal to the dissident right, but also trying to appeal to normal Republicans. It's such a confusing message, such a confusing person that I don't know how much salience there really is for it. I don't know how much trajectory there is for it. So, it's more of a question of not just, oh, is Rubio going to be the next anointed person? It's more just that the kind of creature that Vance is just doesn't seem to have salience. I think the Gabbard loss is a big deal because it is that sort of last person in his faction in the White House gone. But it goes to a broader picture, which is that the faction that Vance represents, this tech optimist, Theo Tradcath, or Orthodox, perhaps traditionalist and multipolarity enjoyer, is not really something that exists in real life, which is what people in that camp are learning in a very, very immediate and horrible fashion for them, which is the Republican Party can't be contorted in that way that easily. It has to be adopted in some capacity, and Vance is just not the guy to do it. So, I mean, I'm hoping he's out. I have to confess, I was, early on hoping that he could be a voice of reason in the MAGA camp because, Thiel in the past being the techno optimist and, sort of like, I guess you could say, generous to Catholicism because of his relationship with Rene Girard, that disposition, you would hope that he could have a protege that is able to fight against some of the populism, is able to actually assert confidently why we have to reevaluate but still trust in our institutions. But it's just not what happened. It's not the messaging apparatus they've hoped for. And, he's extremely pathetic for that reason. Anyway, it's kind of a rant video, but I was interested in just working through this because JD Vance is, for how much I despise him, an interesting case study in American politics right now. And I'd be happy to know what people think in the comments. So, thank you for listening and have a nice day.